Welcome to Fundamental Freedoms. My name's Steve Burgess, and I'm broadcasting from my home in Utah.
I'm David Sabine. I'm broadcasting from my home in Ontario. You can catch us at fundamentalfreedoms.org. It's a website we've recently put up. You can find some really nice articles that Steve has been authoring. Please do check them out. We also publish these videos at this Facebook group. Then I upload them to YouTube and Rumble and at locals.com. Locals is another platform, fundamentalfreedoms.locals.com, where you can carry on some discussion with us and check out all of our past streams.
We believe that good society is based upon good conversation. It's okay to come into a conversation not prepared to do battle. It's okay to change your mind, and it is okay to have respect for those that you disagree with.
Steve and I have made two agreements that we think help our discussions amongst ourselves and with guests. The first of those agreements is that we avoid undefined they statements. So if we use the word they, we try to be specific about who that refers to. We also try to avoid undefined we statements. So regardless of our individual affiliations or our memberships, our groups, we are here this evening speaking on behalf of ourselves as individuals, and we ask that our guest do the same.
Well, tonight we're excited to have Len Faul with us. We're going to go ahead and bring Len on screen.
Sure thing. So, Len, here he is.
Hello, Len.
Good evening. Welcome.
So, Len, let me just speak first. I reached out to Len because I became aware, well, actually, I reached out to a group online called Police on Guard. That's the Twitter handle, and the Facebook handle is Police on Guard for Thee. And I became very interested in the void that that I saw that they were now filling. And I reached out to the organization and then was patient. And then eventually it was Len that returned my message, and we spoke by phone. I'm just really honored that he can make the time to be with us this evening. Len, could you please, I don't want to introduce you because we've just met, but if you could please share with us a little bit about your history and how you came to be involved with this initiative, and I'd love to hear from you.
Certainly. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much for the invite. I was a police officer for over 43 years. I started my career with the Metropolitan Police in London, England. I served 11 years there before emigrating to Canada. I had 2 young children, and I saw there were great opportunities for them in Canada. On arrival, I joined the Toronto Police Service, and I served for just over another 32 years with the Toronto Police Service, and I retired with the rank of inspector. So I was a senior officer when I retired. I actually retired 10 years ago. Boy, how time flies.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. When the unknown situation in relation to COVID-19 started over a year ago now, we did not know what we didn't know. Was this going to be another Spanish flu? Were 50 to 100 million people worldwide going to die? Was it going to be another Ebola? We just had no way of knowing. And I felt comfortable that neither did our governments, not the federal government nor the provincial government, and certainly not our local health authorities in the province and in the cities. And they asked us to take certain precautions. And both of you know what Canadian society is like. If we are asked politely, we are probably amongst the most compliant people in the world. We will do what is asked of us when we're asked nicely. As time rolled on, and as we watched the situation unfolding around the world, it became obvious to everybody that there was a certain segment of our society that was at great risk. This being our elderly folk, particularly those with comorbidity issues, and those that were in long-term health facilities, and I use that term advisedly. because I wouldn't call most of them healthy. But it was obvious, even from the statistics that our own government, our own federal government, Stats Canada, were publishing, that for anybody else that got this dreadful flu, Wuhan flu, as it should correctly be called, it's a 99% recovery rate. Not only that, it is no longer an emergency. We've known about this for over a year now. It's not something that is rapidly developing and likely to cause millions of deaths. We know exactly what it's going to do. We know who's at risk, and we know under what circumstances they're going to be at risk. However, our governments, provincial governments particularly across the country, based on information only from their immediate health authorities, decided to introduce some emergency measures. In Ontario, we have the Reopen Ontario legislation, which is not reopening Ontario at all. And then came on the heels of that, the lockdown regulations, the stay at home and don't do anything regulations. And as I started to read through these regulations, as is my wont, I realized that immediately that they fly completely in the face of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I read through the regulations, I read through the legislation, I read through the Emergency Measures and Civil Protection Act, and it's very clear that all of these acts and regulations are supposed to comply with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and they clearly don't. They clearly take away fundamental, inalienable rights and freedoms from all of our citizens. They shut down businesses, they shut down schools. No school children are at risk from this. Most of the teachers are going to be young, healthy, fit individuals that are not going to suffer from this. And I became quite frustrated and really annoyed with our governments, both all levels of governments. I live in Ottawa, which is our capital city, and our mayor here is somewhat more open, I think, than most mayors, insofar as he tried explaining to our premier that here in Ottawa, our numbers are not that bad. We were not seeing an increase in deaths. We were not seeing an increase in cases. In fact, we were going the other way. And the province is already broken up into zones, health-related zones, and could not understand why Ottawa was being penalised along with the rest of the province. And it wasn't a problem anywhere else in the province, I should hasten to add. But the Premier, Doug Ford, in his infinite arrogance, stated at a press conference in Montreal that he didn't want to see hordes of Quebecers flooding into Ottawa. Hordes. He did go on to say that he loves Quebecers and they're lovely people and so on, but the arrogance of the man was unbelievable. And also the ignorance of his capital city. Here in Ottawa, we actually have three cities. We have Ottawa, Gatineau, and Hull, separated only by the Ottawa River. We all have friends and family in Gatineau and Hull. Many of our workers here in the city come from those dormitory towns of Gatineau and Hull. And there was never, ever, for us anyway, some suggestion that the rest of Quebec would come flooding into Ottawa. Far from it, far from it. We are sort of a long way from anywhere other than our local people. And I was frustrated, and I knew I had to do something. I wasn't sure what I could do. As I say, I've been retired for 10 years. I'm yesterday's news, and I had to do something. Fortunately, my wife came across the Facebook page that you have referred to, Please Stand on Guard for Thee, and she said, you should check this out, see if you can be of any help to them. So I contacted them, much the same as you did. And I explained to them who I was and what my experience was. And they said they'd be only too pleased to have me help in whatever way I feel I can. And so I acknowledge that the officers that started Police on Guard for Thee, they are active officers, and their identities at this stage must remain secret, because as soon as their services know who these people are, no doubt in my mind whatsoever, there will be reprisals, and they know that too. So therefore, they wanted somebody who has some experience, who would support their message, and I wholeheartedly do. It's a message that comes from my heart and my experience, not necessarily just from the Police on Guard for Thee. And so, I have been trying my utmost to reach out to other active officers to explain to them what their roles and responsibilities are, and also to members of the public to try and educate them as to what the police can and cannot do. Their powers are quite limited under provincial legislation, and the enforcement of these regulations should never have been given to the police. It's not a police responsibility. We didn't do it during the Spanish flu. We didn't do it during the Hong Kong flu. We didn't do it during SARS. I was in Toronto working when SARS was about. We didn't do it in the bird flu or the swine flu. It's just unbelievable that this was hoisted on the police to enforce. This is not a policing matter. It is a health matter. And they're turning ordinary, everyday, good citizens into criminals, treating them like criminals when they're not. They're just people that want to go about their business. They want to follow their religious beliefs. They want to protest in peace. And they just want to get on with their day-to-day lives. They want to see their children and their grandchildren. I certainly do. I've got 5 grandchildren. Won't stop me from seeing them. And I have a group of friends that I haven't physically seen for over a year now, because none of them feel that they want to be in a crowd anywhere. And it's heartbreaking. So we have to make sure that even if this comes to an end, and it doesn't look as if it is going to come to an end soon, even if it does come to an end, that it must never happen again. That they must be held accountable for the wrongs that they have committed to the citizens of this country, to the wrongs.
Who's they in this
I'm
statement
sorry,
here?
the governments.
Okay.
The governments. The government, our federal government, from the Prime Minister on down, and from our provincial governments, from the premiers on down. They must be held accountable. And that's the only place that can happen is in court. And that is why I'm quite pleased to be a signator to an injunction taking the governments to court. And this, the Police on Guard for Thee group had already, before I was involved, already hired the services, they've retained, I should say, the services of Mr. Rocco Glady, who is a brilliant constitutional lawyer. And he has no doubt whatsoever that we will see this through to the end and we will be successful.
Len, thank you so much for that history. There's so much there that I hope we can explore. I'm almost tempted to jump in with some clarifying questions, but I think let's not for now. So Steve and Len, Steve and I have prepared, each of us, a fundamental question that we hope we can explore with you, understand your perspective, your interpretation of this question of ours, and then through the rest of our conversation, these 2 questions will sort of form a framework or a focal point for Steve and I to bring the conversation back from wherever, all the bird walks that we might take. My fundamental question, and just very briefly, and I'll maybe talk about it in more depth later, but it's really about this idea that it seems to me there are tests at play. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada is being tested. The governments in Canada, federal and provincial, are being tested. The officers are being tested. The citizens are being tested in ways that I think we've never been before. And I would love to know from your perspective, what you think the nature of that test is, and whether you think we're going to whether we're going to pass that test. But we'll come back to that. Steve, over to you. If you could relay your fundamental question, please.
So, Len, my question is specifically about policing. I've noticed many police forces throughout North America seem to have on their cars or on their shields or emblems to protect and serve. And that seems to be a fairly ubiquitous sentiment about what a police officer is there to do, or why a police force is comprised, is to protect and to serve. The other thing is you hear policing referred to as law enforcement. And so is, in your opinion and in your experience, is protecting and serving, is that an opposing or a complementary endeavor to enforcement? And how do you balance those things as a force, as an individual officer, and how does enforcing the law play into serving and protecting, especially in light of the current situation and many of the things that you've expressed? So that would be my question.
Okay, so where do we go from here? Len, one of the things we might do is just let you share your thoughts about the two statements we've just made, or is there something specific you'd like to drive at right now?
I think overarching both of those questions, and certainly the answers to them, is an explanation as to where the Charter of Rights and Freedoms fits into our law, into our culture and our society. And if I may,
let's be, yeah. And so if you might be speaking on behalf of a former inspector. I can appreciate that a constitutional lawyer might have a complementary perspective, but compatible, I would hope. And by the way, I have a copy of it right here if we need to refer to it. But yes, please. Steve and I, we were talking yesterday, and maybe to frame this part of the conversation, he observed that, and we're having some technical difficulty with your video, Steve, so I wonder, we just have to be patient here. Sorry about that for the audience. Steve observed that as he now lives in Utah and is a citizen of the United States, the Constitution of the United States appears to be given its authority by the citizens, in the sense that the Americans got together and said, we've decided we will create a government and we will give it some powers. Whereas in Canada, the first statement on the charter is, Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law. Is this opposite in ways? Where does the charter, of rights and freedoms in Canada derive its power?
In 1982, when our constitution was patriated from the UK, the government of the day recognized, the federal government recognized that Canada would be a very strong democracy, very strong. They also recognized that with strong democracy, both at the provincial and federal level, there needed to be some safeguards for its citizens in order that governments did not overreach. So the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was written up with the help of, as you say, constitutional lawyers, other lawyers, politicians, and even members of the public. Everybody, not everybody, but a large cross-section of the public was asked what they thought, what they wanted to see, and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was generated. And it was placed...
Sorry, it followed the Bill of Rights by a number of years?
Yes, it did. The Bill of Rights.
Does it supersede that?
Yes, it did. Okay. Yes, the Constitution, same in the States, I guess, is our supreme law. There is nothing higher than it. And the reason that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was put inside the Constitution was exactly for that reason. It was to make it the preeminent law of the land, but also to ensure that those rights and freedoms were not taken away by any level of government. And so all laws, whether they be municipal bylaws, provincial laws, or federal statutes, must be tested against the freedoms and rights entrenched in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And if they're not, they can be challenged in a court of law. And as we have seen on many, many occasions, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms will be predominant. It will win out. It's rare, very rare, for our Supreme Court to have said, under these circumstances, we feel that on the balance, it is better for our citizens that this particular circumstance flies, yes, it flies in the face of rights and freedoms, but it's better for the citizens overall. And that, as I say, it is very rare. We've seen many, many laws struck down because they did not pass the test against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
Len,
So,
do you have any familiarity, or you said you were an active on the force during SARS, during swine flu, bird epidemic, etc.
yes.
Was the Quarantine Act of, I think it's a 2005 piece of legislation in Canada, was that ever brought to your attention? Was that ever brought to bear, I guess, in any of those types of situations?
Not within an enforcement perspective.
Okay.
In fact, people were asked to quarantine and they complied. Unfortunately, we had quite a large number of police officers, particularly in one part of our city, that had been in the 3 hospitals that were initially identified with SARS. They did not contract SARS, but because they had been in that situation without wearing any PPE, they were quarantined. They stayed at home. They were still taking their days off. They were still being paid while they should have been working and so on. But they were quarantined at home. But there was never any suggestion that they'd be thrown in jail, given serious fines or arrested or anything if they didn't quarantine. No suggestions of that at all. I was on the Metropolitan Police 1968 when we had the Hong Kong flu there. And it was very sad. 30,000 people died that particular year. But again, there was no suggestion of police enforcement or locking people up without due process. None of that happened at all.
Can I ask here, Len, sorry to interrupt you, but what might you say to someone who would say that they should have taken those extra measures back then? That those 30,000 people may have perished because we didn't lock down and the police didn't exercise specific enforcement. What might you say to that?
I would say to that, at the time, as I said before, we didn't know. We had not done it during the Spanish flu. Why would we now do it for something that wasn't quite as virile as that? We'd just never done it before. It just didn't. I don't think it crossed anybody's mind to even think of that. And
we've certainly not done it without, as you said just a moment ago, due process.
No, and that's another part of what we're facing here. And I think we have to come back to that a little later. But during the course of the last year, where we have seen very, very draconian lockdown rules, where we have seen hospitals being told they can only deal with COVID patients, therefore selective surgeries were shut down. People that were in need of diagnosis and treatments didn't receive them. Children weren't allowed to go to school. Businesses shut down. We have seen family lives falling apart. We're seeing a lot more domestic violence, a lot more substance abuse, and sadly, a lot more suicides. By the way, all of that is dealt with by your frontline police officer.
Yeah.
And we are now clearly seeing the devastating effects of lockdown are far, far worse than the virus could ever have been. And there are several now preeminent studies that would support that. This is not Len talking now. I know what I see in my own community. I know what I see in my own friends and family. But now we're seeing some really good studies. And
can
people,
I just add, sorry, like
yes,
not only the list you've just expressed, but Ontario in particular has had some of the strictest lockdowns, I would argue, worldwide. For example, when, Steve, when you and I started this podcast a number of months ago, it was around the time that police in Ontario were given the authority to enter into someone's home without warrant.
no,
And Len, correct me if any of this is in error, but they could also remove people forcibly from a home if there were suspicion that they weren't part of the same family, and that had never happened, I think, in Canada. Also, there have been journalists now that have been arrested. In Canada, there's a pastor in jail right now. I just wanted to add a couple of those examples to the list.
yes. Yeah, that if I have been working in intelligence, and we were dealing with organized crime. And these are people that think nothing of murdering the opposition. In order to go into one of their homes, I would have to convince a judge that I had more than probable grounds to believe there would be evidence in there. And I can tell you, just to get one search warrant would often take several bankers' boxes full of evidence, hard evidence. And even then, the judge may not give it. And these are hardened criminals that we were dealing with, vicious thugs. So to suggest that a police officer could enter a house without a warrant is just, it's abhorrent to me. It's abhorrent to, I think, every thinking police officer. Nobody would do that. And we believe the house, your home, to be sacrosanct.
And yet,
No,
some officers have been doing that and have done that. Like, I wonder, I hope through our conversation you could share some experience or maybe some thoughts around how this document can be so easily forgotten.
I think there's a certain amount of deliberate attempt to ignore the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. As you say, maybe it is a test. I'd never thought it in that light. I just honestly believe that our politicians got caught up in not knowing themselves what to do, and they listened to only one narrative only, and they felt that they had to do something. That was my initial belief. But I think there is more than enough evidence to show that they should have conducted a cost-benefit analysis to any lockdowns. And I'm not talking just financial, I'm talking in terms of health, education, and social situation. And they've not done any of these, and they've chosen deliberately not to do so. And you have to wonder why. And again, it's not just our provincial government, now our federal government are locking people up who are coming home. Our charter says it's okay for Canadian citizens to leave whenever they want and come home whenever they want. And now they're being detained in quarantine camps without any due process whatsoever. None. That is illegal. Under any other circumstances, the people responsible for this would be charged with forcible confinement. And I can't believe that the public is just going along with it. That's the other thing that just amazes me.
I can't believe it
They
either.
seem to think, well, the government's got to do something. They've got to protect us. Protect us from what? There is
Lynn,
nothing to protect us from.
you just said the words that is illegal.
Yes.
So I have a family friend who is a constitutional lawyer, and I've not talked with her much about this, but when COVID-19 was sort of breaking in the news, and it was still unclear how this would pan out, I was starting to be of the mind that maybe we're overreacting to this. But she said that she reminded me that this document that I'm holding guarantees the rights and freedoms set out in it, subject only to such reasonable limits prescribed by law as can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. So can you help me understand what reasonable limits may apply here, such that the government can quarantine and forcibly detain, as you say, a Canadian citizen, limit their mobility rights, limit their legal rights, their security of person, force people to have something enter their body, which was not allowed in the Quarantine Act of 2005, for example. What reasonable limits, what does that mean?
There is a test that has to be applied to legislation that is believed to be contrary to the Charter on Rights and Freedoms, and it comes from a case of R.V. Oakes, and we refer to it simply as the Oakes test. This is our Supreme Court decision, which means, again, it's final, and every piece of legislation must be held to that test. And it's a 4-part test. And it's not really that straightforward, but the Civil Liberties Group actually simplified it somewhat so that laypersons like me could understand it, and they refer to it as the ACORN test because it's a condensation of what the Oakes test is all about. And the first test that has to be applied is what is the purpose or objective of the limit. And is that an important objective in a free and democratic society? So I guess you could say, is it reasonable to consider people's health in the larger sense? The benefit of the masses outweighs the negative for the few. Possibly. That's certainly the first part of the test. And then the second part is, does it work? Does the law or action achieve its intended objective? Well, lockdown is not achieving its intended objective. People are dying. People are committing suicide. People are turning to substance abuse. People are going bankrupt. Children are not getting the education that they deserve. It is not achieving the objective. Is it reducing the number of cases that we are seeing? Well, if we stopped the phony PCR tests, yes, it would reduce the number. There would be a natural reduction of number.
Or even with the phony PCR test, as you say, comparing some jurisdictions that heavily locked down against other jurisdictions that did not lock down, the patterns of the cases rising and falling seems to be nearly identical. I'm talking
Absolutely.
about Arkansas beside Kansas. I'm talking about North Dakota against South Dakota, and so on. Like, there's tons of these examples: Texas, California, Florida.
Absolutely, you can look across the pond to Sweden and England. Basically, the same size population, basically the same mortality rate, basically the same infection rate. Sweden never locked down. England went through worse draconian lockdowns than we did. And it achieved nothing compared to, and Sweden's economy never faltered, their education systems never faltered, people got their selective surgeries.
So this debate is going to rage on for decades, but I think back to the test you're talking about.
Certainly.
The safest statement might be that it's not clear that it's achieving the objective.
No.
And
Therefore, it
is that
fails.
is that the third part of the test, and therefore it fails that test?
That's the second part. It has to pass every single part of this. And as I say, it's doubtful, but arguable that it may or may not pass the first test. Certainly doesn't pass the second test. And the third part of it is where I think it is most damning. This is where the ACORN test has put minimal impairment proportionality under the same heading of what else does the limit do? This question combines those two, and you can ask to consider other outcomes, side effects, and consequences that may result from the law or action. These lockdowns, as we have clearly seen, are brutal. They're worse than the virus. Worse than the virus. Therefore, it fails completely, which is why we are seeing in many cases now, particularly those that have started to almost get for trial in Alberta, the Crowns are withdrawing them. They're withdrawing the charges. Now, why would that be? Mm-hmm. They don't want a decision. Even if they win at the lower court, by the time this gets to the Supreme Court, they will say, let's have a look at the Oakes test. You fail on the first part and you fail on, and the whole thing falls to pieces.
I'd like to add a context here, because you've mentioned a couple times now that the harms of the lockdowns are obvious, as you say. I think we should that's a claim that should not go without citation. So I'd like to add that Statistics Canada, I believe 2 days ago or 3, published, or at least I became aware of it 2 days ago. They've now published a document showing that through the first part of 2020, the excess deaths in Canada closely followed the case numbers, closely followed the COVID-19 deaths. But starting in the fall, September-ish, the excess deaths no longer follow the COVID-19 fatalities. So there's a gap now that can't be explained by COVID deaths, and they speculate that gap now is filled with largely overdoses, unfortunately.
Yes, suicides quite often.
Statistics Canada, this is not known to be a group that futzes with their numbers. These are carefully published numbers, and I think we should heed the warning.
And they are a controlled arm of the federal government. So this is your federal government telling you what those numbers are. And I think they're quite plain and obvious.
Thanks for taking me through that Oakes test. I've been wanting to understand it more. I've been monopolizing the conversation here, Steve. I'm sorry.
Len, so for a long time, you made an interesting statement in your introduction, said, we're Canadians. We're pretty polite. If you ask us nicely to do something, we're generally going to comply with that. And I would agree. I believe there's, and I don't know what the numerical number would be, but I would say in general, the government, preponderance of scientists, whatever, make some statements. We think you should probably wear masks. It'll be years before we have, perfect empirical evidence about it, but we think it may help. We feel like if you'll stay in your nuclear families, generally, especially if you're seeing those numbers rise in your community, that will help. Limiting to some extent or to whatever extent possible your comings and goings and shopping and the rest of it, and those kinds of common sense things, we think that may help. And I think that 80-90% compliance could be achieved simply by saying that. Maybe south of the border here, 60-65% compliance. We don't qualify as Canadians in that regard, but and then to add to that what you've referred to, and I would agree in a lot of cases, draconian lockdown enforcement measures and to go to the extent of creating special legislation, even to have to get to the point of applying the Oakes test in Canada and saying, what freedoms might we limit or whatever in order to do this. Those kinds of measures, I can't imagine add more than 5 or 10% extra compliance to what's already willingly happening in society. And so my question is, and I don't know that there's an answer to this, but is it the virus itself and the pandemic situation itself that creates the suicides, the depressions, the divisiveness, the political and social divisiveness that we've seen just really get out of control in both our countries, probably all over the world to some extent? Would that still exist, or is it the attempt and the overreach by government to try and, I don't know, somehow get that extra few percentage points by force? Is that what is creating the negative effects of the mitigation efforts?
I think that will become a very, very interesting social study, and I'd like to apply for a government grant to do that. And I don't know that it will ever be achieved. I think what we've just got to look at is what's the result. The government, the provincial governments, federal governments have done this to us. They have caused this. If people were just simply asked to comply, as you say, Steve, I think the vast majority would. And if they did not interfere, and this is where I think it really is rankling an awful lot of Canadians, interfere in our rights to assembly, whether that be for religious purposes or for sporting events or to protest against the government, for us to dare to say that we don't like what you're doing to us and send the stormtroopers in to disperse us. We don't like that. We don't like that. We can stop, as Canadians, we can stop being polite and we can stop being complacent. So at the end of the day, the government, the provincial government, the federal government must be held accountable.
Lynn, go ahead, Steve.
Oh, so we see these. David just shared with me the incident that happened in Alberta, where the young man was pulled out of his tractor for crossing the road. There was the incident I saw a few months ago about the someone in a costume outside of is it a stormtrooper costume or something outside of a comic book store, and the police came with guns drawn, and we see, these hyper sensationalized, one-off kind of situations. Share with us some of your experience. And maybe going back to my fundamental question, that balance between enforcement and serving and protecting the public in general. What are police officers being faced with right now in Canada, in your experience, and from what you've heard, and how are the good and the bad, how are they navigating that?
Yeah, and I think the answer to this can ping a little on your earlier question in relation to the difference between serving and protecting and being law enforcement. Quite frankly, we do not think of ourselves first and foremost as law enforcement in Canada, no more than I did in England. I have explained a little bit about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and I don't think you need to be a constitutional lawyer to be able to read that. It's straightforward. It really is simple. It was deliberately designed to be simple that way. And all officers in Canada take an oath of office, much like doctors take a Hippocratic oath and lawyers take an oath and so on. Police officers take an oath, and it is to serve and protect citizens, to guarantee everyone's rights and freedoms, and to discharge their duties faithfully, impartially, and according to the law. The prime objective of an efficient police service anywhere in Canada is the prevention of crime. That's the first thing that we have to do, is prevent crime. Next comes that of intervention when crimes have been committed. So law enforcement is not high on our radar. We're good at it, we do it, and we're very effective at it. But it's not our raison d'etre. Working with our communities is paramount to us. We work on the premise that we can't get our job done unless we have the consent of the public. And that's based on what Sir Robert Peel said in 1829 when he organised the Metropolitan Police as the first organised police service, that the police are the public and the public are the police. Throughout my career, I was still a member of the public. I had family, I had children, I had friends. I went to sporting, I played sports, went to sporting events as a spectator. I volunteered with a number of organisations. I was a member of the public. We're all members of the public. We're all in this together. And as a police officer, I could not get my job done without the help and consent of the public. And what this situation is causing, and again, I have to wonder if it's being done deliberately, it is causing a rift between the police and their public, between the citizens and their police officers. And we've not experienced that before in Canada. We're seeing some really unusual things happening. In Toronto, my police service, if there is a protest and it's a group of people that are saying to their government, you must stop these lockdowns because they're bad for us, the mayor cannot say to the chief of police, I want you to go in and arrest people and issue tickets. He is prohibited from interfering in operational side of policing. However, we have heard Mayor Tory at a news conference saying, these people on Dundas Square, what they're doing is wrong and it must be stopped. That's a very clear indication to me.
The police force is then being used to go and stop that activity.
Absolutely. At the same time,
under somebody's authority, presumably.
Absolutely. The chief is responsible for operational policing. Just like on the plaque on the president's desk in the White House, there's a plate that says the buck stops here.
Yeah.
Stops with the chief of police. He's the one that calls the shots. And in Toronto, a couple of weekends ago. Go ahead.
Just for clarification, the government is three branches: the executive, the judicial, and the administrative branch. Do police forces such as the Toronto Met or the RCMP or the OPP, which branch do they fall under, if any?
They don't. There is what's called a police service board.
They are public, like
They're
you
public.
say. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, they are public. And there is a police service board that is responsible for setting business plans, for identifying priorities, for setting standards, for negotiating during grievances with wages, etc., during times of arbitration and so on. And also they hire the chief and the deputies. But what they must not do, what they are not allowed to do, is interfere with the operational side of policing. So they could and by the way, the mayor sits on the police service board.
Okay.
And the mayor is responsible for hiring the chief and the deputies. Did I say that? Yeah, okay.
You didn't, but now you did.
Okay, they're responsible for doing that. And in Toronto, acting chief James Raymer, I'm sure he would like to be the chief. And if he hears the chair of his police service board saying that what these people are doing in Dundas Square is wrong, I think that's a pretty clear message. Mm-hmm. What's said behind closed doors, I can't comment on because no one will know. But the situation in Toronto was interesting because whilst a couple of weekends ago, whilst that anti-lockdown protest was taking place, in another part of the city, another protest was taking place. Friends of the Foundry. They were protesting about the impending demolition of what they would like to have seen designated as a historic building. A city councillor was there, 2 MPPs were there, and strange enough, the leader of the Green Party was there. And do you know who was not there? No police. Not a policeman in sight anywhere. And there were a couple of hundred, from what I could see from the video, there was at least a couple of hundred people protesting. They had signs, not wearing masks. They weren't social distancing. They were lawfully exercising their right to gather and protest. And quite rightly so, there was no interference by the police because there was no need. None at all. So even within one city, we can see a disparity between who's being treated one way and who's being treated another. Now, in Vancouver, they have quite frequent protests there. And the health authorities have said to the chief there, you must get out there and disperse these people and start arresting them and start issuing tickets. And he basically said no. The media immediately jumped all over this and they started vilifying him and he's not doing his job. And he then made a clear public statement. He said, we've looked at the COVID situation. None of these people are at risk. They're not doing anything wrong. They are exercising their rights as designed in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Here in Ottawa, which is our capital, just finish the analogy here. Here in Ottawa, which is our capital city, a couple of weekends ago, on Parliament Hill, there was a protest. You can't have a gathering there unless you've got a permit. And the authority for policing Parliament Hill resides with what's called the Parliamentary Protective Services. Under a federal act, they are given the authority of police officers for Parliament Hill. And that follows the dreadful situation of a domestic terrorist killing a voluntary soldier at the Cenotaph and then forcing his way into Parliament buildings and finally being shot by the Sergeant at Arms. So they introduced the Parliamentary Protective Services, and for all intents and purposes, they are the police for the Hill. And on the day that the protest took place, strangely enough, my wife went with her sister and husband. There were a few hundred people there. They were protesting the lockdowns. They were protesting the quarantine camps. They were protesting masks. They were concerned, and there was a young teenager there talking about friends that had committed suicide. And the Parliamentary Protective Services were there in uniform. They let people in at the gate. They mingled with the crowd. They were respectful. They were polite. They engaged in conversations. What they did not do was issue any tickets. They did not arrest anybody. They did not harass and disperse the crowd and chase people away. They said what their job there was to do was to protect the